that will never work. You can't put yourself seriously. Don't. Oh my God, that's another thing you do. That's bad. You probably should find other hobbies. You ever learn how to stop? Be happy. You don't bother. I've seen better people. Do you really want to? And my third grade, get up. Welcome to Horrible Writing, the rawest, most candid, in-your-face writing show on the interwebs because none of us have time to suck. Let's do this. Welcome back to Horrible Writing. This is episode 30. I'm your host, Paul Sadine, and I hope this finds you well. Great news. We've got another author interview in this continuing series that you all are really loving. And this time, this is going to be a very interesting conversation because I've never spoken to someone who has come forward, who is willing to come forward and talk about this. I'm very excited to have on with us S. Evan Townsend. He's a spec writer. He's been called America's unique speculative fiction voice. He's a prior military person like me, so we've got that in common. And then on top of it, he loves Starbucks and happens to live in Washington State. I can't think of a better person to have on to Horrible Writing to talk about some very interesting, very deep conversations about being bipolar and being an author. So S. Evan Townsend, welcome to Horrible Writing.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'm really excited to have this chat with you. You responded to a call that I put out there for Washington area writers, and I love talking to other writers, and especially I am, a little partial to Washington State writers. But when we talked about the topic and, what you and I could chat about, you were very upfront about what you were willing to have a conversation with. And I really, really respected that because I don't necessarily see a lot of people out there talking about it, and especially as authors. And I think this can really be helpful. So what you said you were willing to come on the show and talk about was, being, we're going to talk about your writing, obviously, but being bipolar as an author. So can you kind of ground all of us from the very beginning of this episode? What is being bipolar? How does that manifest itself in your daily life and in your writing life?
Bipolar is, they used to call it manic depressive. You go through cycles, and there's actually 4 different types of bipolar, and I'm type 2. Type 1 is the classic sine wave bipolar, where you're up, you're down, you're up, you're down, you're up, you're down. You're either manic or you're depressed. You're manic or depressed. I'm type 2, which is you're depressed a lot, and then every now and then you're manic, and I'm usually an angry manic, which is not good at all. And so you're depressed most of the time, but you're manic occasionally. And that's what I have suffered through. Right now, I am on 4 psychotropic drugs. I can't do lithium. I tried lithium, and it made me just a milquetoast. It made me a worthless human being, I thought, because I wasn't writing. I wasn't doing anything. Back then I was working at my job. Right now I'm retired from my day job, and I write full time. Well, part time. I don't have enough work to write full time, but I worked in the corporate world, and on lithium, I could not make a decision. And you can't be that way in the corporate world. I was just analysis paralysis. I was too afraid to make a decision when I was on lithium. So I went to my psychiatrist and I said, I can't do lithium. And he said, okay, we'll try some other things. And after a few years of goofing around, we finally found I called it a drug cocktail of 4 drugs that keep me not manic, not depressed, but a normal, stable human being. And I did this in my late 40s. So I was manic depressive most of my life, and it gets worse as you get older. And I didn't know what it was wrong until my father was diagnosed as bipolar. And then my mother said, maybe that's what's your problem. So I went and checked it out, and sure enough, the psychiatrist said, yeah, you're type 2 type 2 bipolar with dysthymia. Dysthymia is just a fancy word for depressed. And so my life has improved greatly. It's because I am now on meds to control my bipolar.
Mm-hmm. How does now I've dealt with my own bouts of depression, nothing severe or even possibly clinical, though sometimes I do flirt with that. So I'm curious for you and for that creative spirit that you have, how does your mania differ from your depression? And the reason I ask that is, as someone who struggles with depression too, I've got one thing to focus on, and I need to do those things for me to keep me balanced and healthy, right? So that's bad enough of a struggle, but to have this sway where you go from this depression to mania, what's that like?
The depression, I call it the cloud. It's just, you feel like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. Mm-hmm. You have this cloud over your head, and for some reason you are just sad. Sometimes it's an angry depression, which is an interesting thing. You don't feel like doing anything. You don't want to do anything. You want to. I'm unfortunately, I like to eat when I'm depressed, because it's self-medicating basically, and it's a weight on top of your head is the best way I can describe it, that just pushes you down, and you don't want to do anything at all. And I'll be very honest with you. I spent 2 years, I woke up every morning going, if I kill myself, I don't have to go to work.
Yeah.
And I never even told my wife that until a few years ago, after I got on medicines, that I was suicidal almost every day when I woke up in the morning. I think, I got my guns are in the safe. They're not that far away. I could just kill myself, and side benefit would be I won't have to go to work today. And but the mania, I used to say I had a bad temper, because you rage, and you can't control the rage, and it just is uncontrollable. I've done things I am ashamed of when I was manic. It's not always that bad, but it sometimes it just one time I was in Portland and I got lost, because I don't know why I got lost, and for some reason I got into a manic stage, and I just was screaming at other people and other cars, and I was driving like a maniac because I wanted to get where I was going, and I was lost, and I couldn't find my way around town. And now I know Portland pretty well because I lived there for 5 years, but that was the first time I'd been there, and I just was out of my mind. And my wife and my kids were in the car, and my wife's going, "You're going to kill us," and I go, "I don't blanking care,"
Right, yeah.
And you just rage.
So
and
how does that? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's a scary thing when you look back on it. Oh,
yeah, no, definitely. So, and that's why I love when folks like you will come on the show and you'll share these parts of your story, because it fascinates me. That's enough to deal with in life, and to try to survive in the corporate world so you can, provide for your family. But a lot of people would stop there and just deal with that. And you've taken on this additional burden, if you will, of, being a creative. You're creating stories, and I'm fascinated to know how this plays in both that steady state depression, but also this raging mania that you just described. For you as a creative, how does those two elements, how do they impact your writing?
Well, before I got on the meds, I would have trouble writing when I was depressed, and I would write like a maniac when I was manic.
It makes sense.
Makes sense. I could write when I was depressed, but it was slow. I'd write a couple of pages and I wouldn't want to write anymore. But when I was manic, I could whip out 10,000 words a day,
Right.
And, but the stuff when I wrote when I was manic was written down. It was okay, but it wasn't really good. The stuff I wrote when I was depressed was the better writing of the two stages. But I didn't want to write. I almost had to sit down and force myself to write.
Wow.
And when I was working 50, 60 hours a week, I didn't have time to write, to be honest with you, because I'd get home from my corporate job and I'd just want to Vegemate in front of the TV. And so luckily, before I retired and started writing as my primary job, I figured it out. I got the drug cocktail figured out, and now I'm steady state. I still have swings. My psychiatrist says every now and then your brain chemistry is going to overcome the meds.
Mm-hmm.
I still have some depression. It's not bad. I can still write through it. I can still write well through it. I still have slight maniacs, but they're not angry rage maniacs. They're more like, hey, today's a beautiful day, and how you doing? And can I get some coffee for you? And that kind of thing.
You're the happy guy in town.
I'm a happy guy. Yeah, when I'm no longer a raging rageaholic when I'm manic. But it affects my writing. Like I said, if I'm manic, I can write. And now even just the slightly manic I am with the meds, I can write a good 4,000 or 5,000 words a day. And if I'm just a normal person, if I'm depressed a little bit, I pretty much don't want to write, but I can force myself to do it.
Okay.
But that's like 10. That's like 1,000 words a day, maybe 1,500, maybe 500 on a bad day.
Mm-hmm.
And you just gotta live your life around it, like I have since I was a teenager. And actually I started having depression when I was in grade school. So you just gotta live your life around it.
Yeah, no, and it's admirable that you're able to do that, because I mean, being a creative, anybody who's listening to the show, more than likely you're a writer, and more likely than not you're at the earlier stages of your career, so you know that these things, you probably see a lot of friends and people in the writers group fall by the wayside. So Evan, for you, I mean, it's admirable that you still plugged along with all of those things. And it's the irony of life that your better writing came during the time when you didn't want to write.
Yeah.
Oh, the writer gods, they can be so cruel.
They can be cruel. I think the reason I wrote better when I was not wanting to write is because I took it slow and I thought about it and I wanted to do it. And when I was manic in writing, I just flew through it and then didn't do a very good job of self-editing while I was writing.
Now, with these phases, did that change the way you approached the book that you were working on at that time? Because I know myself, I write mostly horror, dark thriller type stuff. So for me, it's real easy to just stay in that dark headspace all the time. Wow. Even when I'm in a great mood, all I have to do is turn on the news and something's going to piss me off and I can be in that dark headspace. So for you, did those two, I don't want to call them two realities, and excuse my ignorance if that sounds ignorant. I not having experienced it myself, I'm not really sure what it feels like, but So for you, did it change how you approached the words on the page at all?
That's a very good question. Let me think about that for a second. I think you're right, because I write science fiction and fantasy, but I try to write thrilling science fiction and fantasy. My books aren't heavily cerebral. They're supposed to be fun. And when I write, I try to write with a rhythm. You have some fun, and you have a transition to get to some more fun. And by fun, I mean an action scene,
Right.
A shootout or something, or two wizards going at each other with their magic. And so you write the magic scenes or the action scenes are easier to write when I'm not depressed. and sometimes I can say, oh, I get to write an action scene now, and I can be depressed, and that will actually draw me out of the depression. Writing that scene. I was feeling manic one day. I can't remember. Yeah, this is before I got on drugs. And I just sat down and I started writing an action scene, and it turned into this short story that I never tried to sell anywhere. But it was a car chase in Seattle, and it was like a 4,000 word car chase. But I was manic, and that's what I wanted to write was an action scene, and that's what it turned into. On the other hand, I wrote an action scene. I'm trying to remember which book this was. I wrote this action scene. I go, well, this is a really good action scene. I'm going to write a book around it. And I did. But I'm for the life of me right now, I can't remember which book it was. Anyway, not neither here nor there. So sometimes the media helps with writing the action scene, and writing the action scene can actually put me a little bit in that manic mode. But writing the between scenes, you can't have action constantly through a book.
Right.
Like I say, it has to be a rhythm. It has to be some action, some downtime, some action. Otherwise, you're going to wear out your reader. And writing the downtime scenes are hard to do when I'm manic, but they're pretty easy to do when I'm stable or slightly depressed.
Okay. Are you a word goal target kind of writer?
I'm a write until I'm tired of writing that day.
Okay, fair enough. and that's why I was wondering if you were, how being, the manic days would be great because you'd feel like you conquered the world. And then those days of depression, I could see how that would be almost debilitating if you're air quotes, failing to meet your word count, for 2-3 weeks at a time.
Yeah, I don't guilt myself over the number of words. If I write 500 words a day, I'm happy. If I write 5,000 is rare, but it does happen. But if I write 5,000 words a day, I'm just more happy.
Excellent. No, that's great. And and actually, I don't know. We can circle back around to that. I know I'm dropping this in your lap. One of the things I like to do on these episodes, Evan, is to what I call, and prior military guy, you'll understand this, but I like to provide listeners with tips, tools, and tactics to help them deal with life as a writer, to keep them writing, because I want to see a world with, more stories, with richer stories. Yes. So if anything pops in your head, we can always circle back around to it. But I am curious, through your experience, if there is somebody listening to this who's been writing for a year, they're still testing their mettle, and they are a target writer where they've got to get 800 words a day or they'll lose their minds, and they happen to also be bipolar, any practical tips that you might have to them so that when that depressive state kicks their butt for a couple of weeks and they're not meeting that word count goal, that they don't give up the craft.
Yeah, that is exact. Well, I say this to everybody who's a writer, because, and I say it to myself constantly, and it's the simplest thing in the world. Just keep writing. And it doesn't matter. Like I say, I don't get upset if I only write 300, 500 words a day, because I've written words. And I think I haven't written since Friday of last week, which is, that's 4 or 5 days ago, because I've been so dang busy with other stuff. And I think I wrote 500 words that day. And I don't beat yourself up over only writing 500 words. Just keep writing. Just keep doing it. If you write 100 words a day for a year, that's 30,000 words. That's not bad.
Right. Right.
And that's half a novel. That's a short novel, obviously, but that's half a novel. And that's only 100 words a day. And 100 words a day, I can barely write my name in 100 words.
That's true.
So I tell myself, and I tell everyone who's struggling with writer's block, or is struggling with manic depression, or is just struggling with depression, just keep writing. And you can't fix a manuscript that hasn't been written. You can write a manuscript and you can go back and say, this is crap, but you can fix a manuscript that you've written. If you haven't written anything, you can't fix it. So just keep writing.
That's actually a great comment. I absolutely love that comment. And I love that tip, tool, and tactic too. There's a lot of legitimacy to it. Listeners, if you're a longtime listener of the show, you already know that one of my goals is to have zero word count days. Every day I want to write something. And like you just said there, Evan, some days it's 100 words, which takes me, 5 minutes to get in front of the computer screen and get them out. But even with the life demands, I can, getting those 100 words down means I did not put a goose egg in my word count for that day, and I'm happy. And it keeps the rest of my life balanced. So I absolutely love that advice. It's practical and it's helpful. So have you, with this life experience, writers know this. So if you're a new writer listening to the show, maybe for the first time, you might not have heard someone say this, or you may not even have thought of it yourself, but all of our characters have a little bit of us in them. So Evan, with your experience that you're sharing here in this episode, have you taken your experiences with bipolar and not necessarily created a character around that, but have you done that to one of your characters? Have you given them manifestations or symptoms of being bipolar as part of a plot line, or maybe even just a minor characterization of who they are?
Well, yes and no. In my published novels, my science fiction and fantasy novels, I have not done that. Mostly because I want my novels to be fun, and being bipolar is not fun, especially if it's untreated. But I did write a novel that I have not had published. I'm thinking of independently publishing it, and it's about a writer who is bipolar, and his doctor puts him on lithium, and he can't write. Well, this is exactly what happened to me. My doctor put me on lithium, and I couldn't write. I couldn't do anything. I was a lump on a log, and so I wrote that. It's 100,000 words long, and it's I haven't tried to sell. Well, I did try to sell it for a while. I couldn't get it published, New York traditional publishing, and I'm thinking of self-publishing it maybe under a pseudonym,
right,
or a nom de plume, because it's totally different from anything else I've written, and it doesn't even have a happy ending. So that's the only case where I've taken my bipolar and given it to a character, because I purposely wanted to write about what being bipolar is like.
Right. And I asked that question because I was curious about, the type of reception that a character would get especially if the author has personal experience with it, and could contribute authenticity to that character's experience. So I was curious about that. And as I thought about our interview, I was trying to rack my brain about any character that I've ever read who struggled with being bipolar, and I couldn't think of one. So
I can't either.
It's interesting that, well, I'm sure there's someone out there who has tried to tackle that with a character. I just haven't come across it myself. So I figured I was going to ask you while you were here. So with your fans, I know you do cons and whatnot and speaking engagements. Yeah. Do you talk about this besides this? Do you talk about this publicly?
I'm very open about this. It's my psychiatrist said it's like type 1 diabetes. It's genetics. It's not your fault. It's just, it's like having, well, it is. It's a genetic disease. I got it from my father, and he may have got it from his father. We don't know. They didn't have that, back in those days.
Right.
But probably got it from his mother. I'm thinking about her, but. It's like type 1 diabetes. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything to get it. You were just born with it, and there's no reason to be ashamed of it, and there's no reason to blame yourself. And so I'm very open about it. I have done panels at cons talking about bipolar and how it affects me. So I've done this before in public, in person, with people sitting in front of me talking about my bipolar.
What's been the reception to that?
People are very receptive to that. They're sort of surprised. For some reason, a lot of people with mental illness still have this shame thing attached to it.
Yeah.
And I don't. I'm not ashamed of being bipolar. I'm frustrated by it. I'm pissed off at it. Right. but I'm not ashamed of it because it's not my fault. It's just genetics.
that's such I like that you keep reinforcing that, because, I obviously we don't know who will ever come across this. Once it's released to the ethers, it's going to be out there forever. So it's very important, I feel, and I'm so glad that you keep reinforcing that message. So I've got, before I get to putting you on the spot for a horrible writing experience, I'd like to ask you one more question, about the public face of an author. Again, with my audience being newer to the game typically, and maybe still trying to feel out successful tactics. With being bipolar, do you have anything that you would think to share with anybody, new writer or experienced, it doesn't matter, when it comes to managing your presence in the public sphere? So your Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever you're doing out there, obviously public appearances as well. Are there anything, maybe learn through harsh life lessons, you make a mistake or whatever it may be, any tips, tools, and tactics that you would provide or recommend to listeners when it comes specifically to talking about this stuff? Because you communicate it so well.
Oh, thank you. What I do, I try to brand myself, and how I brand myself is, in my writer life, I always have a hat on, and it's a fedora on, and that way and when I'm walking around con, I have a fedora on, and that way I'm saying, I'm branding myself as the guy with the hat on, pretty much. But when it comes to my bipolar, I don't use that as a gimmick. I don't use that as a sales tool. I simply use that as, if somebody is listening to this podcast and they don't know why they're mad, and then they're sad, and then they're mad, and then they're sad, maybe they'll go see a doctor and find out what's going on. And that's my hope. It's my hope that through this, or maybe they know they're bipolar, but they're trying to work through it, and they don't know why lithium makes them feel stupid. And they'll go to their psychiatrist and say, I listened to this guy on the radio, and he said lithium made him feel stupid. And lithium makes me feel stupid. Maybe we should try, some other drugs, and hopefully he's got a good enough psychiatrist, or she has a good enough psychiatrist who will work with them and do that. And so that's my hope, that by being out there, is that I can help other writers or other people with my problem.
Right. No, and that's absolutely excellent. And when I was and listeners, I believe I've said this before. If I haven't, it may have been one of the early episodes. When I was enlisted, I worked in one of the jobs I had when I was enlisted was working in the mental health field, and I know that during that time, that was one of the things we dealt with a lot was, cultural expectations or cultural shaming from having any mental health diagnoses. For some reason, a broken arm is fine, bad knees, totally okay. Oh, wait, you're suffering from depression. Let me keep you away because you're an oddball type of thing. So, it was really hard for folks to deal with. So having you come on and just share this about the normality of it all, and it's just, it's not your fault. I love that you keep saying that it's not your fault.
Yeah.
That's such a healthy message to bring. So with that in mind, since you've been so kind to share all these awesome tips to help other people out, let me put you on the spot. Now, Evan, each and every episode, I bring on a writer and I ask them for a horrible writing experience. It could be anything. What is your horrible writing experience that you would love to share with people publicly?
I wrote this YA fantasy, and I'd never written YA before, but the character was a teenage girl. The main character, the protagonist, was a teenage girl, and it had unicorns in it, and it was a fantasy. And I wrote it, and I sent it out to beta readers. I said, "Is this any good?" And they said, to a person, they all came back and said, "This needs a lot of work." Like, what? They said, this really needs a lot of work. I'm like, oh, geez. And it's been sitting on my hard drive ever since. And finally, a friend of mine I was talking to, about, probably because of this horrible writing podcast, I was talking to a friend of mine who hadn't read it before, and she said, well, let me see it. So I sent it to her about a week ago, and she's reading it now.
Okay.
But then I decided to write another YA fantasy, my second YA fantasy, and this time I had a male protagonist, and he had a female friend who went with him, and it had dragons in it instead of unicorns. And not only did I sell that story, but it got picked up for an anthology.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
So see, listeners, that is the takeaway right there. You know, he put something out there, everybody to a person tells them, this is not going to work. A little bit of rework, a little bit of repackaging, reframing, and look at that. That is awesome. All right, Evan, before we get out of here, I want to actually give listeners an opportunity to go check out some of the stuff that you either have coming out or the things that they can already go find now. So can you give us a few highlights of some of your work that you think some listeners might be interested in finding?
Sure. I have currently 10 published science fiction and fantasy novels, 5 fantasy and 5 science fiction. My latest novels is a series called Treasures of Space. And the first novel is Treasure of the Black Hole, where I take the 1940s film noir private detective about 3,000 years into the future. And he has to find out why people are killing over the treasure of the black hole. Is it the stuff that dreams are made of? And
that's interesting.
And then I wrote 2, didn't even plan this when I wrote that novel. I ended up writing 2 sequels to it, Treasure of the Pirate Planet and Treasure of the Rogue Moon, which is my latest book that came out in June. I'm writing prequels, and one is in proofread mode, and the other one is about 9,000 words into it. He was a intelligence agent for the Core Empire, which is surrounds the Earth, the solar system, and it's the evil Core Empire. And he didn't realize at the time it was evil, and he was working as an intelligence agent. And the first book is Smugglers of Mars, and I'm hoping to have it out about, probably April or May. I'm hoping to have it finished and out there. And it's Chumba of the Intelligence Corps, Book 1, Smugglers of Mars.
And listeners, I will make sure that I get the links to Evan's work so that you can go out there and find it. But I imagine any of their favorite retailers will be able to find your catalog.
Probably. And of course, I'm on Amazon, both Kindle and paperback.
Okay.
And except for the last 3 books, the Treasures of Space series, all my books are Barnes & Noble, Nook, iTunes, Smashwords. The last 3 books are on Kindle only because they have that Kindle deal thing. Amazon does. And those are my only 3 self-published books at the time.
Okay.
My other 7 books are published by a small press publisher.
Okay.
And if you really want to find me, just go to my website, which is s7townsend.com.
And I was going to ask you about this. So you already beat me to the punch on that one.
Oh,
excellent.
Sorry.
No, you're totally fine. It's good because that way we've got it right there. Evan, I really want to thank you for coming on and talking about this and sharing so much of your story with folks and sharing so many tips, tools, and tactics. It's going to, I truly believe that it's going to help someone, whether it's today when they hear the episode or, a few years from now when someone trips across a podcast, but you've made a difference, and I really do appreciate your time.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate you having me on to interview me.
Oh, it was definitely a joy. Definitely a joy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been Horrible Writing, and hopefully after this episode, you suck less than you did at the beginning. I am Paul Sading, your host extraordinaire. You can find me over on the Twitterverse at Writing Horrible and over at paulsading.com/horrible-writing. Until next time, suck less.